Hey everyone, welcome to The Explainer. So today, we're basically stepping in as your dedicated sense makers. If you've ever felt totally overwhelmed by the sheer volume of data, opinions, and news just flooding your feed every single day, well, you are definitely not alone. In this Explainer, we're taking a super eclectic, rapid-fire assortment of 18 different informational posts, all grabbed from a single 24-hour window, and we're distilling the whole shebang into one cohesive, structured presentation. We've done the heavy lifting of organizing the chaos, so you can just sit back and focus entirely on understanding the core ideas.
To keep things organized, here's our roadmap for today. 1. Tech and the future. 2. Reevaluating human history. 3. The real Rivendell. And 4. Modern social debates. Okay, let's dive into this with Section 1, Tech and the Future, Engineering Tomorrow's Milestones.
We're kicking off our look at the hard numbers driving tech today with a pretty striking figure, 61.1%. According to our source data, this represents Tesla's U.S. loyalty rate. It literally puts them at number 1 across the entire car-making industry. And honestly, it's a massive retention metric. It really helps explain some of the other wild data points we're seeing right now, like the fact that the Tesla Model Y completely dominated California's top-selling cars in the first quarter. I mean, it moved well ahead of traditional, long-standing giants like the Toyota Camry and the Honda Civic. As one of the sources pointed out, once drivers actually experience having that supercomputer-backed navigation and, never having to stop at a gas station again, that 61.1% loyalty rate, it begins to make perfect sense. Now let's look high above our heads for our next massive upgrade, and that is Starlink's aviation bandwidth. We're talking about moving from original hardware that supported around 220 megabits per second to these new aviation terminals hitting peak download speeds of 400 to 500. But the target is what's truly staggering here. The latest dual-channel aviation terminals are aiming for 1 gigabit per second peak speeds per terminal. That is absolutely wild. But what's actually crucial here isn't just the raw speed, it's the architecture. The hardware allows for this thing called seamless connection migration. Basically, if a link fails, the connection just automatically moves to another antenna without dropping your network. That is a total game changer, especially for massive aircraft like the Emirates A380s that use multiple antennas. When we talk about space exploration, people always obsess over the height of the rocket or the thrust of the massive engines. But the metric that actually matters, the one you should be watching, it's the cost per kilogram to orbit. Just look at this trajectory. Pre-Falcon rockets cost a mind-boggling $54,000 per kilogram. Then the Falcon 9 came along and brought that down to $1,500. And now, Starship is targeting under $100. Let that sink in. That is a 500 times reduction in cost over just 25 years. This right here is the fundamental curve that actually makes becoming a multiplanetary civilization. We're talking lunar bases, orbital industry, the works, financially possible. It's the absolute foundational metric that all other space innovations flow from. Wrapping up our tech segment, we've got to touch on the absolutely blistering pace of artificial intelligence. Our source material noted that Grok 4.3 successfully built an entire, fully playable game from just a single prompt using the XAI API, with reports showing it having the fastest output token speed out there and even outranking other models like Claude Sonnet 4.6 in some specific metrics. It's just a stark reminder. It shows how incredibly fast AI capabilities are expanding, moving from just generating simple text to delivering complex, instant software engineering.
Moving right along to Section 2, Reevaluating Human History, Echoes of the Past.
We're opening this section with a rather heavy but vital quote from the source material. History is paved with rivers of blood and conflict. The sources we're looking at here push back aggressively against what they call the noble savage myth. That idea that ancient human tribes just lived in total, peaceful harmony with nature and with each other. Well, the data and historical ecological perspectives presented actually suggest something very different. They show that our phylogenetic history, long before European settlers ever arrived, was heavily shaped by violent expansion and fierce territorial conflict.
To really wrap our heads around this ancient expansion, we need to look at a specific group, the Yamnaya. Around 5,000 years ago, these extreme mobile pastoralists were absolutely thriving in the steppes north of the Black and Caspian Seas. They were likely the very first people to domesticate the horse and actually utilize the newly invented wheel and cart. And this tech combo, it allowed them to exploit the open grasslands and expand both economically and physically at a breathtaking pace. To picture them, archaeologists in the source material compared their horse-based expansion to the Comanche in the U.S. Southwest. The wildest part? Today, nearly every European language descends from theirs, and they contributed up to
90% of modern European DNA.
Now, what is really fascinating here is how the genetic data actually debunks our simple assumptions. You might assume this massive DNA spread was just a straightforward, overwhelming male-driven conquest, right? Well, genetic tracing of Y chromosomes and mitochondrial DNA reveals a really complex two-step process. First off, there was a heavily male-biased Yamnaya expansion, but when they reached the edge of their range, they bumped into the corded were people. And in a surprising twist, the Yamnaya actually lost out in that specific interaction. The corded were males absorbed the Yamnaya females, which then triggered step 2, a secondary male-driven expansion under the corded were culture that carried that steppe ancestry even further west. It's just a brilliant illustration of how ancient cultural interactions were incredibly nuanced, not just a simple story of straightforward domination.
Let's shift gears to Section 3, the real Rivendell, literary inspirations.
Let's trace the legacy of the Lauterbrunnen Valley in the Swiss Alps. This is a place widely believed by scholars to be the real-world inspiration for Rivendell in The Lord of the Rings. There is just something about the sheer scale and breathtaking beauty of this valley that literally demands a response from writers. Think about this timeline. In 1779, Goethe stood at the foot of its falls and wrote a famous poem. Then, over a century later, in 1911, a 19-year-old J.R.R. Tolkien hiked through this exact same valley. He slept in haylofts, walked mostly by map, and the impact was just profound. So profound that in 1967, at the age of 75, Tolkien wrote a letter explicitly describing this trip. He called it the part of the world that had the absolute deepest effect on him. It's such a beautiful reminder that you can walk into a landscape once and it will just stick with you for the rest of your life.
All right, let's move into our final segment. Section 4, Modern Social Debates, Navigating Today's Divides.
Our source material highlighted a really interesting interview with author Rachel Wilson about a phenomenon she calls the paradox of declining female happiness. The core argument presented here is that even though modern women are the most educated and financially independent in history, reported levels of dissatisfaction are actually rising. The sources cite a 2009 study and point to data like 26% of U.S. women currently being on psychiatric drugs. Wilson argues that women are feeling deeply torn by the pressure to, quote-unquote, have it all, trying to balance intense career ambitions with desires for a family. On top of that, the source argues that as women have outpaced men in college degrees and salary equality, it's created this demographic conundrum. Many women are now struggling to find partners they consider higher achieving, which the author argues leads to increased feelings of loneliness, despite unprecedented societal independence. Building right on those shifting gender dynamics, the source material also points to a stark statistical divergence in political leanings over the last quarter century. Get this, over a 25-year period, young men have reportedly become just 1 point more conservative, but in sharp contrast, young women have drifted 23 points more liberal. The sources neutrally highlight this data to showcase a significantly widening ideological gap between young men and young women that has rapidly developed over the past few decades. The sources also touched on the ongoing debates around election security and voter identification. This specific quote was amplified in the source material to challenge the political narrative that acquiring voter ID is an unfair obstacle or a form of soft bigotry. The quote, which is attributed to a Black Army veteran and member of Congress who holds 6 forms of ID, is used by the source to push back against the argument that securing identification is inherently prohibitive. Instead, the source uses this perspective to advocate for what they describe as a fair and secure election process. Well, we have covered an immense amount of ground today, from the plummeting cost of reaching orbit and the ancient genetic expansions across the steppes to the literary magic of the Swiss Alps and the complex social data defining our modern era. But to tie up our final segment on societal shifts, we want to leave you with this provocative question, drawn directly from the source's data on political drift. What has changed for young women that hasn't changed for young men? It's a profound question that asks us to look deeply at the contrasting data we just explored. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. Keep asking questions, and I'll catch you next time.